Undungeon is a game that lets you be the person you are rather than the person the developers want you to be. It's an excellent example of what a game can achieve in the minds of a player if it treats its world like a living, breathing organism with real people, instead of caricatures that only exist to act out the narrative. The game handles choice and decisions in a way few games have before it. Undungeon forces you to make decisions you aren't fully prepared to make, and live with the consequences of those choices. You may come to blame Undungeon for its lack of context or evidence, but it's not a lack of experience or talent on the developer's part that causes this. It's a strong vision. In this critique, I will cover Undungeon as best as I can. I will talk in depth about the game's major flaws. And no, I will not sugarcoat any of them. The game has so much untapped potential, and I'm going to talk about where it may fall short and where it can still excel. This critique is for someone who's already played the game. I suggest that if you haven't played it, you watch my review. It's a short what you should know before playing kind of video. That review is completely spoiler-free. I'm going to be very critical of this game's flaws, and if you haven't played it, then you are going to miss out on a lot of the charm and the intrigue that makes up for a lot of the criticisms I lay out here. I will try to keep the total spoilers to a minimum, but I think, like most games, any spoilers can lead to misunderstandings and potentially incorrect preconceptions when consuming media initially. All I can say is you've been warned. While Undungeon stands out among other games, it's not always for the right reasons. I will be talking about the best parts of the game, but before I need to talk about what went wrong. I'm going to be honest and do my absolute best to be fair. There's a lot in this game that misses the mark. In the original Kickstarter, there were a lot of promises that get left unfulfilled. And while I think leaving those promises on the cutting room floor was likely the right decision, there are some people who will think that is the biggest issue with the game. And that's a fair criticism for someone who originally backed the game to have. The game was originally supposed to have 7 playable characters, traversing 7 worlds. In the game we got, only 2 playable characters and 2 different worlds are available. That's a big difference from the 7 promised, especially if the 2 worlds and heralds we got aren't the ones you thought looked most interesting. The game was also presented as a roguelike, touting procedurally generated world and permadeath, with no benefits to dying besides the knowledge you gained. Roguelike is a word that's thrown out a lot nowadays. There are some people who would say that Undungeon is in fact a roguelike, and they would be wrong. That's not me being a snob. There is a word used interchangeably with roguelike, and that word is roguelite. There is actually a difference between these 2 words, and most game marketing teams, publishers, gamers, and reviewers of games should be using the term roguelite when they call a game a roguelike. For those of you who have heard of roguelikes but may be confused by how often the 2 terms get switched around, I'll explain. A roguelike with a K is a game that shares many core mechanics with a game called Rogue. Rogue is an ASCII-based game where you play as a rogue who needs to travel to the bottom of the Dungeon of Doom in order to retrieve an amulet. The key features that caused this game to spark the roguelike genre are permadeath, procedurally generated dungeons and items, turn-based combat, grid-based combat, many enemies, and more. When I say procedurally generated items, what I mean is that items have a name, but the name is never the same across multiple playthroughs, and its name doesn't explain what the item does. The only way to know what it does is to test it or to identify it with the scroll of identification. The most simple and straightforward guide to the term roguelike is the Berlin interpretation, which I'll link below in the description if you're curious enough to look up what roguelike actually means. While the Berlin interpretation is by no means gospel, most hardcore roguelike fans can agree that a lot of the elements that it lists are essential to any true roguelike experience. There is a bit of debate on exactly what makes a roguelike, but for many, permadeath is a requirement. Anything without permadeath is not a roguelike, and at best has roguelike elements, which is the definition of the term roguelite with a T. In the game, you can feel the developer's initial drive to be a roguelike over a roguelite, but this ends up being a hindrance to the game achieving its best form. While they originally wanted permadeath in the game, I can only assume that they decided to remove it because it was too extreme, then added in checkpoints to alleviate that headache. This isn't me being a hardcore gamer saying that games suffer from not having permadeath because it's too easy. It's actually quite the opposite. In my initial review, I pointed out how punishing the mechanic is when enemies hit you multiple times. What I didn't say in that video is that in the playthrough I was currently on, I hadn't had any trouble. In fact, I went on to beat the game without dying even once. The thing is, I was able to do this because it was my 4th time starting the game. I played through the demo 2.5 times, and going into that playthrough, I knew how to prepare my character to make fights relatively easy. This knowledge-based advantage is a standard practice in roguelikes, and one of their major draws. The issue with Undungeon is that enemies get stronger as time goes on, and while the Herald can respawn, things can happen between checkpoints that put you at an all-around disadvantage, such as losing your teammates to permadeath. You are able to recruit some of the mortals in the world, and they can cut the game's difficulty down immensely. In the end, each mistake you make without restarting causes the game to be that much harder. Dying and going back to a checkpoint right before you die will cause major frustrations for players instead of dying and having to go back to the very beginning. That may sound much worse, but what if I phrase it like this? You can either die 5 to 10 times every single story mission until you finally beat it just to die more the next time, sometimes losing hours of progress because you didn't visit a mirror when you should, or dying 3 to 4 times in total and having to restart at the beginning each time. While I agree a single death is more frustrating with permadeath, the game as it is will be much more frustrating to anyone who makes more than a handful of mistakes. To relate it back to Rogue, getting items is completely random. You can never be sure you'll get anything you might want. In one playthrough of Rogue, I accidentally threw my melee weapon at an orc. It was a simple misclick, but I ended up killing the orc and saving my own life. But the thing is, I meant to shoot an arrow at him instead. I ended up losing my melee weapon until I died a couple of floors later. If the game didn't have permadeath and there was a checkpoint right then and there, beating the game from that point on would have been significantly harder than just restarting. I would likely have gotten a melee weapon eventually, but I would have died countless times while getting it. You can argue that just because there's no permadeath doesn't mean that people can't restart if they want to, but the thing is, most people won't stop a game they're not enjoying just to go back to the beginning and try again. Most people will put down the game out of frustration rather than restarting all over from the beginning, even if that's the way the game was developed to be played. When you die in a roguelike, it's not usually because you made one small error, it's because all of your choices up until that point have left you unprepared for what lies ahead. 100 do-overs won't fix that, so I stand by what I said. This leads to another side effect of the game not having permadeath. If you were able to power through the rough start, there's a good chance you love difficult games, which Undungeon is not. It's punishing, but avoiding those punishments isn't hard once you know how to do it. With no difficulty setting, it becomes hard to justify another playthrough of the story based on the challenge alone. Anyone who would do another playthrough just for the story probably stopped playing in their first playthrough before they even finished the Q dimension. This is a huge shame, because the story elements of the game are by far the most interesting aspect of the game, and I'll talk about that more later. All this being said, if you clicked on my video solely to see someone complain about the game because of how hard it is, it may sound counterproductive, but I ask you to quit your current playthrough and start over again. It might be a hassle, but you'll really enjoy the experience more if you start a second playthrough instead of just trying to power through it. In the end, Laughing Machine should have either committed to the roguelike aspects of the game, or, what I think is the better option, they should have leaned more heavily into the ARPG aspects of the game. While this game and the developers pulled heavily from Rogue, There are other games that started out as a roguelike only to be moved into another realm entirely. This game shares much more of a kinship with those games than it does with Rogue. While I think this game, as is, would be much better with no other changes than bringing back permadeath, I think you would do so sacrificing the heart and soul of what this game can be. Undungeon is an unpolished gem, and it has so much raw, untapped potential to be one of the best ARPGs around. So as soon as I finished the game in preparation for this video, the first thing I did was play Diablo. I picked Diablo because for most people, the Diablo franchise is the ARPG franchise. There is debate among fans which ARPG is the penultimate, but if I'm going to be fair to Undungeon, I need to compare it to the Diablo it shares the most in common with. While I personally believe Diablo 2 is the better ARPG of the three, Diablo is the first installment of the series. Another of the many reasons I chose Diablo 1 for this comparison is because its development team's size is much closer to Laughing Machines than the other two. The other thing I want to point out is that while it's true the devs at Diablo had no experience making ARPGs, they literally created the ARPG genre. So when I point something out that Undungeon does better, it's not a knock against Diablo, it's a compliment to Undungeon. While the ARPG genre exists now, Undungeon wasn't made as an ARPG. And comparing one of the sequels made specifically to be an ARPG by a company with tons of employees to Undungeon, which was made by a small indie developer as their first game, wouldn't be doing Undungeon justice. While I'm talking about Diablo, the more astute of you may notice that I'm showing footage from Hellfire instead of vanilla. While most of you won't know or care, I need to make sure that the Diablo fans understand that I did it because I like faster movement in town and the ability to change difficulties. The worst part about Hellfire is the fucking ranged enemy kite paths. Don't at me if you think I committed an unholy abomination by playing Hellfire. I don't care. Actually, I do. And one day I'd like to make a Diablo video. But I'm going off track, preparing for the shitstorm of nearly non-existent Diablo 1 diehard fans who will watch this video. So let's jump into it. Diablo was the game that pioneered ARPGs, and it too was created with the intention of being a roguelike. The game was originally supposed to have permadeath, and in fact, it was supposed to be turn-based. There is a rumor that when Blizzard was picking up Diablo, they demanded it be real-time. Even Wikipedia talks about this. However, this is just a rumor. It was made real-time after Blizzard asked the devs what they thought about making it real-time. Once the Diablo team heard about the real-time angle, several liked the idea and left the choice up to an internal vote to make it real-time or not. When the vote passed, they decided to try it. They made it real-time by having the turn system take a lot of turns very quickly, and they ended up loving it. So while Undungeon might not be the roguelike that it was envisioned as, the devs made the changes they thought was the best for the experience, just like the best ARPG series of all time did. And I think the game is better for it. If you think I'm stretching too much for this Undungeon to Diablo comparison, check out this clip where one of the co-creators of Diablo talks about making Diablo 2.
I said, well, it'd be really cool to kind of put it almost a crafting system, but make it Diablo-styled crafting system. So we put it in this part where you would kill monsters and body parts would come out. And so there were like eyeballs and hearts and wings and like all sorts of stuff or whatever.
Does that sound familiar? Anyway, for those of you who have never played the original Diablo, I'll summarize it quickly. You can choose one of 3 classes to play as, and then you go into a dungeon that has 16 procedurally generated floors. As you play through, you level up and increase your character stats, get new, stronger gear to equip to your character, and eventually beat the game. This game in story, world building, and gameplay is extremely simple. There are harder difficulties, but you need to play online to experience them. Or just play Hellfire, you nerds. So let's start comparing them. First, let's get an easy win for Undungeon. Undungeon's story has more going for it. It has interesting characters and plot lines, and you are faced with difficult choices, controlling the outcome of every single entity you meet during your playthrough. Diablo, on the other hand, only has 8 NPCs, 3 of which add literally nothing to the game or its story. Most of the other NPCs don't add anything besides a shop. I would argue that Cain and Griswold are the only NPCs that add anything of value. And if you can combine all of the other characters into them, you would lose nothing. That's not to say Undungeon is filled with stunning characters. A lot of the characters could have been combined together, been more fleshed out, or cut completely. But almost every person you meet has something to add to the story in a meaningful way. Another way Undungeon surpasses Diablo is the world building. While I think Diablo 2 shows how deep the world of Diablo can be, that's not the original Diablo. The original Diablo mentions things like the East, the inner turmoil of Hell, and a siege weapon of Hell by Heaven. But the world is barely touched on outside of the little town you start in. Undungeon has several worlds, and different factions hold sway over different world events. You have gods who fought with one another, heralds who enforce the god's will but have aspirations of their own, and much, much more. To say that even Diablo 2 has a more fleshed out world would be a reach. I said this before, but I'm not knocking Diablo here. Diablo is objectively a good game, but you have to give credit where it's due. Undungeon is an exciting world with lots to learn and explore. So, we can finally talk about the gameplay. And as I said before, gameplay is king. Anyone who has played Undungeon and Diablo knows that Undungeon has the more robust gameplay. Wait, what? Did I misread that? No, there it is right there. And with this whole did I misread that bit in there. Huh. Now, before you get mad at me and leave a comment telling me I'm an idiot, dislike the video even though you can't see the dislikes anymore and then click off, I didn't say Undungeon has better gameplay. I said it has more robust gameplay. Diablo's gameplay is fun and addictive, but it's also pretty simple. One of the most useful things you can do to solve a problem will be the use of your best friend, a doorway. Actually, while playing through, most of my problems were solved with a doorway. Armies of darkness, beware. The door to light is on my side. Preparation for a difficult fight is basically just throwing all your potions on the ground so you can easily replenish your belt and opening a portal in case you need a speedy escape. While you do have 3 classes in Diablo 1, the class you choose is more like a guideline than a commitment. You can spec them however you want. Spells are gained from books, not class levels, and while the 3 weapon types are generally best for each of the individual classes, you can do whatever you want, whenever you want, with whoever you want. Undungeon, on the other hand, has 2 playable classes, and while unlocking the second one is a huge pain in the ass, there is a lot more diversity between them than there is in Diablo. Your playstyle can differ greatly with a single herald based on your loadout. I mentioned this in my initial review, but your stats are chosen based on your loadout. This gives you a great number of different ways to deck out your herald, and change it up as you get more experience. There are tons of different tools and weapons to use, and even your dash and shield can be customized. While you have so much variety, Diablo's gameplay is more consistent and has much more practical depth and has a better progression system. While the stats on the equipment are completely random in both games, in Diablo you're given ample opportunity to buy and trade for upgrades that suit your style. Every time you visit the town, you can go to the stores and check to see if you have an upgrade. While you don't normally have a need for your currency, a decent upgrade can cost you an arm and even, dare I say it, a leg. So making sure you don't buy random unnecessary items is imperative, or you could miss out on a massive upgrade to your current loadout. Compare this to Undungeon. In order to check a store's stock, you need to remember where each store is even located. And while that sounds like a petty or lazy complaint, transversing through the overworld can be a bit of a nuisance. Going back and forth to the vendor specifically to stock up when you don't even know when they restock, and even worse when the benefit of different weapons is unclear, is a pain in the ass. While I like that they didn't do something like convert all the numbers on the weapons to something like DPS, which some games do, The specific bonus of certain stats aren't clear enough to make telling what is and is not an upgrade intuitive. How sparse finding equipment can be and how hard it is to tell an upgrade takes away from the ARPG experience. In Diablo, when I return to town either because I have a full inventory or I ran out of health potions, I can look at the weapons at the shops and in my inventory, and I know definitively if I'm looking at an upgrade to my current weapon. When I look at a weapon in Undungeon, it's because I've been using my current weapon for so long, and I might as well see if I have an upgrade. But if the stats aren't the exact same as my current weapon, then it's hard to tell if it's an upgrade or not, so I just usually ignore it. And the only time I visit a shop is when it first appears in the overworld because I want the question mark to be gone from my map. These issues I'm talking about will likely stem from when Undungeon was officially converted from a roguelike into an ARPG. Things like weapons with unclear enhancements appearing infrequently is a staple in the roguelike genre, but doesn't work well for RPGs. I think there's a lot of different reworks that can greatly improve the gameplay aspects I've talked about. When equipment has limited spawns, it enhances the choices you make in a roguelike, but hinders the action part of an ARPG. The first change would be to add some kind of standard currency into the game. There is no currency in the Undungeon metaverse, and while that makes story sense because you're dealing with different dimensions, there are better ways of expressing this since all items sell for roughly the same in both dimensions. With no standard currency to work with, I'm always hoarding a ton of junk. While the store might be selling something that I could stack and free up some spaces for trading, I would be trading at a loss because selling them back would get me less value than I paid for them. This results in the player's inventory always being full of items. This is made even worse because by the time I do want to trade with the vendor, I have so much crap I fill up their inventory before I can even finish the trade. This led me to almost never make purchases besides for runes, sutras, primordial matter, and healing potions. I can't just dump my trash to get money. And with equipment not being clearly an upgrade or a downgrade, I don't even buy or sell them. So even though items are scarce in the game, the items the vendors do sell I'm not buying. I can't be sure I'm making an intelligent trade. You can never know for sure the value of what you're carrying. So while you can find a weapon that only costs 1,500, I don't know if I have enough for the next storyline item I need, or if it's even worth it to begin with. This means I don't play with my build, or toy around with things like grenades and knives, because not only are they expensive, but what if I need them? Until you beat the game, you don't know when something may come in useful. The barter system could have been really useful in a game where death means you restart, so you don't want to waste potentially helpful items, but in an ARPG I need currency to judge when I'm making a good purchase. The second change that would improve the game is to make the equipment more abundant. I would use weapons almost solely for bartering and just repair the one that seemed to work best for me. In Diablo, I would do the same thing, but I would actively look for an upgrade with every weapon I got. Compare that with Undungeon, when I played most of the game with the same exact two weapons, one for the first dimension and another for the second, because while the first one was strong enough to carry me through to the end of the first dimension, when I reached the second dimension, the very first weapon I got was an obvious upgrade. With the exception of traveling dimensions, the weapon increase in power was so minor from one to another, there was never an obvious upgrade before or after this. If you're trying to make weapons some super scarce commodity where there's barely any difference between them, then there are other ways I can spend my hoarded garbage, like runes. In a roguelike where dying means permadeath and that's the worst thing that can happen to you, having very volatile difficulties is a really bad thing. However, in an ARPG, having volatile enemy difficulties is great, because a new weapon that greatly overpowers your previous one, being the difference between getting destroyed by the enemies and getting sent back to the mirror over and over again, and destroying the enemy like they're nothing, is part of the fun. If you have a ton of variety in stats from weapon to weapon and a huge difference between a weapon you get at the beginning and one you get at the end, then picking out which aspect of combat you want to focus on can feel rewarding. Maybe armor pen, maybe max damage, maybe minimum damage. The point is there's a ton of stats and weapon types for the Herald to use, but no incentive to play with them. It just feels like min-maxing in Undungeon is a waste of time. This is counterintuitive to the core of ARPGs and leads me to the next issue of the game. There is no New Game Plus. There being no New Game Plus stops the core system from realizing its full potential in the game. The Heralds, along with all other beings, have cores that power all of their abilities. As time goes on, you'll be able to create different cores that you can level up and use. You can attach runes and augments to these cores. Each level of your core will unlock a new rune or augment slot. Runes will give you flat increases to your base stats. They allow you to have more flat damage, armor, health, and other stats. As the game goes on, the flat increase of runes you find will get stronger. So at the start of the game, you will have a rune that maybe gives you 50 health, and at the end of the game, you can find runes that give you 300 health. Then you have augments. There are 5 different kinds of augments: attack, defense, luck, nature, and gloom. While runes give you a flat increase to your base stats, augments give you a variety of percentage increases to all different kinds of abilities. There's an attack augment that gives you a percentage increase to damage, as well as a different one that gives you a percentage increase to critical damage. Luck has increased drop rate for certain items, as well as barter percentage increases, and so on for the other types. While the runes you find will be stronger as you progress through the game, augments have levels and need to be fused together to get stronger, capping out at level 10. A level 1 damage augment will always increase your overall damage by 3%. And if you want a stronger damage augment than the one you have to find another and fuse it together to get a level 2 augment. That means, unlike runes and weapons, you can proactively make your character stronger by investing time and resources into getting more augments. Each core will have a different distribution of how many runes and each of the types of augments they allow. Every core has some number of rune slots, but the types a core allows and the number of each of them is different. While one core may allow attack, gloom, and luck type augments, another core might allow defense, nature, and luck type augments. And while one core will allow tons of runes, but only a small number of augments, another might evenly distribute the runes and the other augments. One core allows a ton of attack augments, but a small number of other augments, and so on. This core system has a lot of potential for min-maxing, and opens up the possibility of a lot of cool builds that can work with different weapon types. So what does this have to do with New Game Plus? Well, when I played through to the end of the game, I did a completionist run-through. I fought in every area, including the ones that popped up. I fought a ton of people in the overworld, and whenever I would stop by a vendor, I would buy all of the essence containers they had, as well as all of the rune upgrades they had. I might not have gone out of my way to buy better weapons, but I would go out of my way to get as many augments as I could carry. This would lead me to constantly upgrade my augments whenever I had the chance. With that said, when I beat the game, I only had 2 cores maxed out, and only one of these 2 cores was a core that could max out at level 30. That's a small fraction of the cores you can create, and I went well beyond what a normal person would do in a single playthrough. Without a New Game Plus, you'll only ever get to use 1 or 2 of the cores you have access to. Even if you don't want to mess around with the cores and just want the strongest augments in a single core, you can't do that. Augments are even worse off than cores. Augments are so hard to power up, it's ridiculous. At one point towards the end of the game, I found what I assumed to be a glitch, and I spent hours there farming augments. In the second dimension, vendor stock would refresh whenever you left the area they were in and came back. This wasn't the case in the first dimension, which is why I assume it to be a glitch. So I went to a vendor that sold a bunch of attack augments. I would buy all of the ones he had, leave, and then come back to replenish my stock of attack augments. I only noticed this towards the end of the game, and when I did this, I only farmed for attack augments. I ended up spending hours of my time and all of my items I had amassed on this completionist playthrough, and do you know what I had to show for it? 1 level 9 attack rune that I didn't even want, and 5 level 6 damage runes, because level 7 was seemingly bugged, so I didn't try and go for any 8s. Do you know how many augments it takes to get a level 9 and 5 level 6s? 416. 416 augments, and the vast majority of them were obtained through this glitch. Do you know how many augments it would take to get 5 level 10s? 2,560. And that's only 5 of the 15 augment slots on the core I was using that I could have gotten to level 10. If I used this glitch in every playthrough and got the exact same number of augments in each playthrough, it would take me over 6 playthroughs just to get the attack augments maxed out. The scarcity makes sense, since you don't want people too strong or else the game will be a joke, but even pseudo-cheating, I wasn't able to get more than 1 level 9 augment. How is a player supposed to change out their augments to have fun with their build when the absolute best they can do is just throw whatever in there they happen to have? A New Game Plus would have helped this issue immensely. While the game really doesn't allow players to customize on their first playthrough, it would allow the game to have more staying power, try and push the limits of the fighting system. Planning a new game difficulty isn't easy and requires a lot of balancing, but the augments feel really unfinished because there isn't one. No New Game Plus is an issue that is dwarfed in comparison by the fact that there is only one save. You wouldn't know there are 2 different heralds to play if you were only watching the gameplay in this video, because I have so much footage of the Void Herald. There is a second herald, but I don't know if I'll ever do a full run through of him as the game is now. Since I only have 1 save slot, what incentives do I have to play the other guy? The game isn't a roguelike anymore. It's not just about finishing the game. What would cause me to play this game again more than the story is the ability to test the limits of different potential builds in the game. But that's hard to do when switching between different characters means wiping out those characters. Anything I do with the second guy will be lost if I ever want to play the Void Herald again. In Diablo, the reason why you start multiple characters is because it's fun to see how strong each character can get, but you usually have a soft spot for your first character. In Undungeon, I have to completely wipe out one of my strongest characters to play as another one, and I can't even do anything with my strong character without a New Game Plus option. I spent all this time unlocking 2 cores, experimenting with his build and increasing his power. So should I play him again to use the knowledge I've gained, or play this new guy? I will probably have to learn completely different movesets, different power-ups, and worst of all, once I get to the end I can't even keep him. I think the second herald is a fucking boss. His moveset looks exciting, and he should have been available from boot up. Story be damned, but I like my very good Void Boy, and I want to play more of him. The game forces it to be one or the other, and I'm sorry, Sarcophagus Man, but my Void Boy is going out for another night on the town. Overall, this game is a really good ARPG. The core system, the weapons, even the second herald have substantial potential to be great. It's just that they can't reach that potential in Undungeon with so many roguelike elements still weighing them down. Too much has been carried over, and honestly, this game can either be an amazing RPG or an okay roguelike, but not both. It's frustrating at times that you can see what's there right beneath the surface, which brings me back to my original Diablo comparison. Diablo 2 and 3 are both superior games to Diablo, depending on who you ask, obviously. But it took time and care to make them better, and they didn't start out that way. It took continued support and love after their release to get them to the level they are now. I don't know how many people remember this, but Diablo 2 and Diablo 3 were kind of crap when they came out, and I'm not just talking about the recent re-release of Diablo 2, I'm talking about the original Diablo 2. These games are loved today because they improved on their faults to eventually give the penultimate ARPG experience people look to them for today. When Diablo 3 came out, it was considered trash by a majority of the Diablo fan base. And for the longest time, Diablo 2 was still considered the best Diablo game. An even longer time ago than that, the same thing happened to Diablo 2. Most people play Diablo because 2 just didn't have that X factor. It's easy to forget, but both of these games didn't reach their potential until they got an expansion. And they had much more glaring flaws than Undungeon does now. Alright, I've talked a lot about this game's flaws. If you were only here to listen to me bash the game, I suggest clicking off now, because it's time to get to the good stuff. If you haven't played this game yet and didn't heed my message in the beginning of the video, this is your final warning. We're entering the spoilery territory now. I'm going to do my best to be vague, but you've been warned. Twice. Undungeon's immortal society revolves around matter. The different gods of Undungeon control the majority of matter in the metaverse. There are 7 gods in total, and they use their matter to build the world in their respective dimensions as they see fit. If you want to create anything, you can only do that if you have enough matter to make up what you want to create. The gods aren't the only ones who can control matter though. All immortals can use it to create. In your playthrough, you will use it to make some smaller things like bridges and smaller representations of the dimensions you visit called arcs. Even though immortals can create things, they'll never have much matter to create with, as it's a very rare commodity in the Undungeon universe if you're not a god. There is a dimension for each different god, and all of these dimensions are parallel to one another. So think of the gods as seeing over 7 alternate Earths as opposed to 7 different planets. Each god can create an immortal herald that serves them. These heralds are literal to their name, and they interact with the mortals of their dimension on the god's behalf, as well as the immortals and mortals of other dimensions, delivering messages and enacting their will where and when they're told to do so. Beyond the dimensions, there is a centralized city that exists referred to as the Hub. It serves as a crossroads for immortals to gather and travel between alternate dimensions. It's the center of life for immortals, where they create weaponry, advance their technology, and serves as a hotspot for the universe. At the start of the game, the God of the Void creates a new herald. He names his herald Void. And the herald, Void, is one of the 2 playable characters in the game. The god tells him that he's jealous of the other gods and tells the herald to go to the other heralds and collect their emblems. These emblems supposedly carry some amount of matter, which will allow the God of the Void to start creating his own alternate Earth in the Void dimension. The gods don't like this, and while the Void is en route to the Hub from the Void dimension, the gods cut the Void dimension off from the Hub so he can never reach it. This stops you from reaching the Hub and throws you into the Void for thousands of years. There's a teeny tiny little problem with this though. It causes all of the parallel universes to smash together. This metaversal collision is called the Shift. That really showed us, huh? Us beta Void boys wanted a small amount of your matter to create our own world. You really showed us how the Alpha Chad gods deal with betas. By fucking it up for literally everyone, including yourselves. Pound it. I'm not even kidding either. All dimensions collide together, causing massive destruction. That includes the Void dimension, and surprise, it has a huge void in it. And that void starts slurping up all of the matter from every dimension. Real smart. Thousands of years pass between when you leave the Void dimension initially and you finally arrive at the Hub. When the connection was severed, you, along with many other immortals, started to fall into the Void. You were going to be suspended there for all eternity, but you are saved when an immortal called the Keeper locates you and pulls you out back into the Hub. You then meet one of the few remaining immortals, a hovering eyeball. The hovering eyeball tells you about his plan to save existence. With the Void having sucked up so much of existence already, it's only a matter of time before everything that's currently stable gets sucked in. I want to point out something that a lot of people who don't know the history of this game will miss. The developers ended up having a good example of making the best of a bad situation. Here we can see there are supposedly 7 dimensions. However, the game has only 2 playable dimensions. That may or may not change in the future, but these worlds were supposed to be playable and were almost definitely cut due to development and time issues. Keeping them in as an example of the worlds that have been completely destroyed by the Void shows us just how completely decimated by the Shift everything is. It's a good way for you to understand just how truly debilitated the current state of affairs is. There were 7 fully functioning dimensions just seconds ago, and now because of the selfishness of the gods, there are only 2, and soon even they will be gone. So the floating eyeball wants you to go around to the remaining 2 dimensions, stabilize them, and then have the hub absorb the remaining matter. Then, if you can, meet with the gods and acquire their matter as well. After you've collected all of the remaining matter not devoured by the void, you'll use it to form a smaller, stable universe protected from the void. This is the result of the gods deciding they don't want to give up a small amount of their matter. Several of them and their worlds have been eviscerated, and the only way to save what's left is to give up all of their remaining matter. Sharing is caring, folks. You now need to go to both of the remaining dimensions and activate 7 piers in each one. That will stabilize the dimensions so they can be absorbed into the hub and then be used to create the new universe. All of the piers have lost their cores, so in order to get them operational, you need to find and reactivate them, then guide them back to their piers. This is where the game truly holds its charm. The themes of your interactions in the dimensions and the way that they make you think and feel. This is what the game truly has to offer each person who plays the game. I've spent a lot of time talking about the self-important gods and immortals. They are both integral to the direction of the multiverse. It was the gods' decision to cut the void off from the hub, after all. The hub, one of the most advanced and important places in the multiverse, is inhabited, ruled, and controlled by immortals. The mission your god initially sent you on was to go and collect something from each of the heralds, the second most important beings in the multiverse. There's an air of importance when it comes to the gods and immortals, like a sense of nobility and monarchy. But the gods are the ones who damned all of existence because of their greed. And for this, everyone has to suffer. And by everyone, I don't just mean the nobility. I mean the mortals too. I've briefly mentioned the mortals a couple times, but I glossed over them on purpose. Mortals are glossed over by pretty much everyone who has anything to do with running the multiverse. The gods didn't care about them much when they cut off the void dimension. The void god didn't care about them when he was asking for the other gods' matter. For the most part, immortals don't seem to care about them either. There may be bigger issues at hand with the ending of all of existence, but even before that, as far as you can tell, they were just overlooked and uncared for. There are some mortals that are important enough to be considered a bother by the immortals. There is a faction of mortals that can travel across dimensions. They are referred to as hazmats, but at most they're a minor annoyance. When playing, you wouldn't be faulted for thinking that they're some big power moving through the universe, as they appear multiple times in different locations all over the dimensions you're visiting. When their story comes to a climax, as they do a full-out attack on the hub, this attack lasts for about 12 seconds, in which they get completely eviscerated. After the attack, you talk to the other mortals who are basically like, what losers? No cause for concern, it seems, just mortals being the bugs they always are. The team that was attacking was supposed to be the forward guard and serve as a distraction for another squad to attach a bomb and blow up the hub. But you find this out from another herald who tells you this is a matter of fact. In the 12 seconds it takes you to vaporize the main force, he found the team that was planting the bomb, wiped them out, and disarmed the bomb. You get a sense when talking to most immortals that they think mortals are incredibly stupid. Even the most advanced ones wouldn't know what to do with information on the ship if they had it. However, while immortals find themselves far superior, mortals have been affected far worse by the current state of the metaverse, and they had nothing to do with it. The dimensions bleeding into one another has caused major repercussions to the wildlife of each dimension. There is also diseases seeping in from one dimension to another. So people are getting ravaged by diseases that no biology in their dimension was ever meant to handle. This makes surviving long enough to even be killed by the void difficult for most mortals. And there are worse things than death in the little time they have left. Even in mortals' best case scenarios where you succeed in collecting the matter of their dimensions, absorbing it into the hub will effectively wipe them out as well. There is no positive side for the remaining mortals of the Undungeon metaverse. In your quest to recreate existence, you will be wiping out all mortal life. However, this inevitable eventuality doesn't make them worth any less in my eyes. The ability to move on when all hope is lost is one of the hardest things for a living creature to do, and it adds so much more meaning to every action you help them with. As you go around to reactivate the piers, the game will point you towards mortals that can help you find the cores in order to get them back up and running. However, in another testament to the pointlessness of mortals, you don't even need them. The cores are super easy to find, and honestly, helping the mortals can be a pain in the ass if you're just in it to absorb the matter. Like I said, they're all going to die anyways. Who cares if you save them from scorpions? Or if you give the Fire Clan a super strong virus that will wipe out all life in the dimension? From your point of view, they're all pointless and meaningless in regards to saving the universe. And with that realization, we've come to the first major twist of the game: understanding. The gods cut you off mid-trip, so they wouldn't have to give up a small amount of their matter to the void. In doing so, they caused a terrible chain of events that damned all of existence, and as an outsider looking in, it's very easy to condemn them. But are you any better? I'm not kidding when I say that mortals can be annoying little shits. Their constant requests can grind on your last nerve when they just never shut up. They tell you so much unimportant crap about their lives and what they do, and it's almost always useless information. This guy will talk your ear off for minutes about what he does. It doesn't matter, at least not to you. To him, there's nothing more important than his livestock, and he will gladly wait for the end of existence sitting here with them. He spends all of his time away from other mortals just because he gets along better with the livestock. This doesn't matter to you or your quest. It doesn't help you achieve your goal. He will tell you outright where the core is, but then he will ask you to help him find his best friend, a scorpion-like creature that he swears is intelligent. You don't have to help him. It doesn't have any amazing impact on the game. This may sound like a random side quest, but after you find the scorpion, an immortal will come and ask you to give it to him. He believes studying it will help further his understanding of the shift. And I mean, why not? It'll just die with the rest of the dimension, so giving it to him seems like the more useful thing to do. Why should you care if a farmer doesn't get a scorpion back? Just like the gods didn't care about the void god getting what he wanted, because it didn't help them achieve their goals. I know it's easy to think it's different, but is it really? The immortal you're talking to didn't actively seek the scorpion out himself. He didn't even know it existed until you found it. The farmer asked you to get his friend back, and you assumedly agreed to it. There is little the farmer can give you that the immortal can't, making him the more enticing offer. However, giving the scorpion to him is the exact kind of thing that caused the shift in the first place. Existence is on the brink of collapse. All mortals know they are going to die, and yet he's still here, making sure his livestock have a comfortable life, and asking a godlike creature to find his best friend because he can't. These are the actions of an extremely noble individual, and this is just one mortal. There are dozens of mortals you will see in this game, and you will almost never feel like you can be bothered to help them because, there's this big mystery on who killed the universe to solve. But when you solve it, it's just what I've been telling you this whole time. A story of selfishness of the gods. A story you might have witnessed every time you rushed a mortal to speak. Each time you made a choice because it benefited you when there was a better, more fair choice to make. I just love this parallel between the god's selfishness and yours. Some players might even decide doing the basic amount of quests for the NPCs is too much, and just find the cores themselves. Like I said, it's not hard. It's also not that most people are going to spend the majority of the game skipping dialogue, or trying to gyp the mortals out of what's rightfully theirs. It's just that it took only one instance for the gods to completely screw over all of existence. How many times did you think of making a similar choice? You may think this isn't intentional, and hey, you might be right. This game does have a lot of things that need tuning up, and I could just be reaching for parallels that aren't there, or weren't intended. But I actually think there's decent evidence to back up what I'm talking about. You can see it in how the mortals treat you. In almost every circumstance, it doesn't matter if it's some nobody in the middle of nowhere or a literal queen of her species, nearly every mortal shows you the utmost respect. Even in my initial review, I talked about how the confusion you feel when you go through the early game is made comical by how the NPCs treat you. but it's humbling as you get further into the game. This trust goes a long way in showing you that you can either use your authority valiantly or abuse the holy hell out of it. They trust you with literally everything, collecting samples, judging criminals, saving an entire species. When it comes to whether a mortal has the right to live or die with the dimension, who could be better than the heralds to choose their fate? There is so much trust placed in you just because you're a herald. It is insane. What's even more insane is that you were literally born yesterday. You have no more understanding of the universe than a child. This isn't a coincidence either. It is 100% the developer's intentions. While I think it was a mistake to lock the second character behind a story milestone, it fits the way the devs wanted the story to unfold. While the player will be starting to understand this world and how to fight, the Void Herald will be doing the exact same thing. The other Herald isn't new and is very accustomed to himself and the world. By the time you can play him, you won't be new or inexperienced either. This goes even further because while he and the player are both accustomed to the world, neither of them are familiar with his new body and powers. Up until you start playing as him, he wasn't encased in that gold sarcophagus you see him in. Meaning that while it makes sense for him to be knowledgeable, it also makes sense that he would not be as good with his current moveset as he was with his old. There is so much thought put into each aspect of the story of this game. I believe that extends to the trust the mortals put in you to make each decision even though you aren't worthy of it. The actual requests the mortals have for you in the game are fairly standard. They basically all boil down to fetch quests. There is usually a reward for completing their fetch quest, which you can accept, demand they offer you more for, or refuse the reward entirely. While it sounds like these are your standard asshole versus good guy options, remember, there's more to the relationship between mortals and heralds than just a quest giver and quest taker. All life in the dimension that you don't specifically choose to be saved is doomed. That will likely be something constantly on your mind when you're helping these mortals. So what if you take all their belongings? They're going to die whether or not you succeed anyways. If you are denying the rewards because they need the supplies more, you're just kind of lying, aren't you? For example, you can tell the last person you help in a dimension that they need their supplies more than you do, and within the day, dematerialize them. What do you think they were going to do with those materials you so graciously let them keep? I think most people would consider it still kind, but there's something else you have to consider. They revere you as a god. You are the closest thing to a god these mortals have ever seen, and they love the gods, for better or for worse. You are not here to judge them on their misplaced faith. The gods may have caused all their troubles, but they don't know that. Because of this, giving them their supplies back because they need them more isn't always the mercy you might think it is. They can find comfort at their end by giving away what they can to a higher power. Even the simple question of should I nefariously take them for all they've got or valiantly deny the reward isn't cut and dry in this game. As a herald, no one you meet who knows what you are doesn't worship the ground you walk on. There are mortals who don't get what you are. Remember, these are gods. Not everyone understands that they even exist. However, you aren't some adventurer asking around to see if you can help someone for a bit of coin. And you aren't a hero sent by a king to slay a monster. You are the walking embodiment of God's will. To many mortals you meet, your presence is literally the answer to their prayers. To the people you meet, you are an unstoppable force who is a light in their darkest hour. No one expects you to do what they ask. But for the mortals who have given up all hope, if anyone can, then a messenger of God would be the one. Here you are, showing up at a time they need you most. In a lot of games, this feels like a cheap cliche. Here, it feels like divine intervention. And it's not that they expect you to help, it's that they literally have nowhere else to go, so they ask you. There are good and bad people in the world, but good and bad is a subjective thing. If someone steals bread to feed their family, you could say that they did what they had to in order to survive, and they would be seen as a hero to their family. If another thief stole the first thief's bread to stop their family from starving, and then the first thief's family starved, then who is the villain in that scenario? This scenario isn't the kind you'll find in Undungeon though. The scenarios you'll face in Undungeon are even more obscure. You aren't a mortal, and therefore do not have the same mortal concerns. Because of your position as a herald, everyone looks up to you for help. The people you meet would never do you any wrong. You can meet two factions on the brink of war, and both have a good reason for it. On one side, their species literally cannot survive without taking the life of one of the other species. No ifs, no ands, or buts. The survival of their species depends on the subjugation and eventual sacrifice of members of another species. A subset of the other species doesn't like the idea of sacrificing their own or being subjugated by them. The survival of the other species is irrelevant to them, and their entire species could die for all they care. A kicker of this is that the leaders of the second species agreed to the subjugation because without the protection of the species, they would die out. The dominant race protects them from the dangers of the land. The younger ones don't care though. They believe they can protect themselves, and on and on. This game forces you make decisions that will affect all of their lives, because no matter your decision, it's better than indecision. While playing, there were times when I would sit thinking for 10 to 20 minutes before finally making a decision. You will sit there judging people's merits on how they treat each other, when all parties would never treat you with anything less than respect and reverence. Even when you make a decision that negatively affects them, they bow to it. The best part of all of this is you barely have enough information to make any kind of educated decision. Even when you talk to everyone involved, you can barely know what the right thing to do is. And I think that's at the heart of why the decisions are so good in Undungeon. What? Confusing story being at the heart of why it's good, but Angel, in your review you said you wouldn't have called it a strength. First of all, how dare you question me in the middle of my own video? Second, I doubt you even watched that review. Third, and probably the only actual important thing on this list, I wasn't playing. I doubt more than a small number of people who play this game will get really excited for how confusing the decisions are to make. When a tough decision presents itself, you'll sit there going over all the information you've been given in your head over and over again, trying to find the best answer. If you're me, you've even been taking notes to make sure you didn't miss anything. At one point, I was so distraught about what decision I should make, I stopped recording my video. Went to the video I just recorded and re-watched the video so I could be sure I didn't miss anything, because God, I had to have. After all of this, I still couldn't decide what the right decision was, and had to go with my gut. There were no extra NPCs to shed light on the events. There wasn't any video evidence I could have found. There was very literally a situation with people's lives on the line, and I had no way of knowing what the right thing to do was. At first, I was mad. How dare this game throw this responsibility on me? I did everything right. I talked with everyone. I paid attention to all of their stories. I made sure to look for any hidden clues. Other games would have given me hints about the true nature of the situation I was investigating. I would be able to figure out if one person was lying, and if one was telling the truth through little hints. In fact, most games would tell me exactly who was right and who was wrong in every encounter, with the most in-your-face reasons imaginable. When I realized that, my anger subsided. Because the truth is, I fucking hate when games do that. I hate it when games are in your face. I hate it, hate it, hate it. It's annoying, it's preachy, and it sucks. This game gives you 2 or more parties where both think the world of you. Then they give you just enough information to make sure you understand why something transpired, with little definitive evidence on what transpired. It's like the example of the thieves I just talked about earlier. Hearing all the facts, you might think one thief is obviously in the wrong, but you could just as easily think it was completely justified. Then, to raise the stakes, all of the participating parties trust you wholeheartedly. They believe no matter what, you will make the right decision, and then whatever decision is made, they believe you are correct. They treat you as a higher power. In the end, you have to be okay with the decision you make. It's not them that will be upset with you if something goes wrong. It's you who will be upset with yourself. Do people you want to live end up dying because of your decisions? They accepted the results of the judgments, but can you accept the consequences of your actions? Do you blame the devs for handing you a question with an unknowable answer? Or do you realize that every situation in any world, including this one, will be the tale from two perspectives? One where both parties believe they're in the right, but someone has to choose which story is the definitive right. Being able to make a decision when you have all the answers is simple. Anyone can do that. Making a decision that can affect lives when you have no idea if it's right or not. The power to make those decisions is extraordinary. Was I looking too much into this game's confusion? I don't think I was. The fact that they locked the Herald that should be more knowledgeable behind the in-game milestones suggests that they were very careful to make sure the Herald we started with was as aware of the world as we were. On your first playthrough, you shouldn't know how things are going to transpire because you don't have the knowledge to do so, where the second Herald might have that knowledge. That doesn't mean I'm right though. This is just one interpretation of one of the themes of the game. There are other themes to explore in this game, like the mirror dimension versus the new reality, and mysteries as to what each party really wanted to get out of each interaction. In the end though, when I started to realize there was almost never a true good or evil, I started to enjoy the weight of my decisions that much more. In reality, you are just another party in the game. You are not the all-knowing God the mortals think you are. You're just some person looking at that computer screen with half of the facts and even less understanding than they do of what might actually have transpired. If you're one of the people who didn't listen to me and watch this video to the end without ever touching the game, you little shit, Undungeon has a lot in it that I think makes it worth playing. I think that with time and love, this game will make it into the ARPG Hall of Fame. But that's really up to the devs. I think as it is, it's a super humbling experience that leaves a lot to be desired in terms of gameplay. Not because what is there is bad, but because it has so much untapped potential. It's a game that wants you to understand that if you can't figure out what the best option is, that doesn't mean that inaction is the best option. You are going to have to make hard decisions in your life. And if you have trouble handling that, you should make sure that you do as much as you can to make sure you make the right decision. Undungeon tries its hardest to show us that making a decision when you don't know if it's the right one doesn't make that decision matter less. It makes it matter so much more. Bye-bye.